Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Olivier Krischer. I'm the Deputy Director at the China Studies Center. I'm very happy to welcome you here for tonight's talk. As is customary, it's my honor to acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose land we meet, on whose land the university is built, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects and our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Land never ceded. Here we're going to talk tonight about film, as you'll see, but I'd like to give a little bit of a background because the Sydney Asian Arts Series this year is in its third year. The series is presented by the University of Sydney's China Studies Centre as one of the supporters, but in collaboration very much with the Power Institute and with the generous support of VisAsia as well as the Art Gallery of South Wales as a partner, and Sydney Ideas from time to time as well. The series presents, the idea is to present leading voices on early, modern and contemporary Asian art and film from around the world. And the theme this year has been art and urban cultures. So art and urban cultures is intentionally broad because the images that we have of intense urbanization that commonly depict contemporary life in India or Southeast Asia or indeed in China as well easily obscure the fact that most of the world's cosmopolitan, bustling cities historically have been Asian. So from Isfahan to Edo, or Tokyo, from Kaifeng to Kolkata, a place that we'll hear about tonight, cities have been major subjects, patrons and audiences for all fields of art, cinema, architecture, of course. So indeed the arts are a part of the urban fabric, you could say. And in 2019, we've invited 4 speakers. We've heard earlier in the year from Suzanne Pavey from the Courtauld, and tonight I'm very happy to introduce Malini Guha. So Dr. Guha is an Associate Professor of Film Studies at Carleton University in Canada. She's arrived just yesterday, come all this way, and she's going to just keep on going. After a couple of days in Sydney, she's going to go to Tasmania, which I'm very happy to report. Her research is broadly concerned with spatiality and cinema, with a concentration on post-colonial and post-imperial modes of mobility, migration, displacement, and settlement. And these are themes that you'll see very clearly in her first monograph by Edinburgh University Press from 2015, entitled From Empire to the World, Migrant London and Paris, which is a study of cinematic London and Paris as global cities from the perspective of migrancy, globalization, and the end of empire in a British and French context. And to take a sort of soundbite from the introduction of her book, by focusing on migrant narratives in a series of films that form the study of the book is interested in, and I quote, mobilities that show up the contradictions of the globalizing process while also contesting a view of city space spaces as non-places. So tonight's lecture is going to be rather different from more recent work about another global city, Kolkata. And I'll allow Dr. Guha to come up and tell us all about that. And afterwards we'll have a period of Q&A as well. Please welcome Dr. Guha.
Thank you. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the Power Institute and to the China Studies Center at the University of Sydney for inviting me to give this talk as part of the Sydney Asian Art Series. I am grateful to everyone who made this trip possible. Many thanks to Olivier, to Lee, to Josephine, to Katie, as well as to Stephen Whiteman, who I realize is not here today, but he was the first person to contact me in this regard, and I'm so pleased that he did. This is my first time in Sydney, my first time in Australia, so I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to share my research with you today. So, the title of my talk, Kolkata Rising, the politics of place in recent Bengali cinema. I would like to begin this talk by discussing the broader stakes of my research in this regard, which involves the subject of location shooting, which essentially means that an entire film or aspects of a film are shot on location in a place, a city, for example, rather than simply being shot in a studio, or rather virtually. In a film studies context, scholarship on location shooting has tended to privilege the role of cinema as archival agent, as noted by Elena Gorfinkel and John David Rhodes in their introduction to a co-edited anthology titled Taking Place, Location, and the Moving Image. By archival agent, they mean that cinema has an inherent ability to document place, and to essentially operate as a moving image and sonic archive of place across different historical time periods. In addition to conceptualizing cinema as an archival agent, Gorfinkel and Rhodes draw from a rich lineage of scholarly thought in film studies, including the work of Siegfried Kracauer and André Bazin, to also argue that place has the ability or the capacity to enthrall or interest audiences irrespectively of what might be happening in the film in terms of narrative events. So they're talking about the moments in a film where you might be watching, a fictional film, for example, and then you suddenly recognize a place where a particular narrative event is taking place. So that moment of recognition might temporarily draw your attention away from the narrative of the film and into an engagement with place, an engagement that might evoke your memories of a place, or you might simply think that you recognize a place, but you can't quite put your finger on what that place is or why you recognize it. If there is a tendency to think about place as simply a setting or a backdrop of a film, these moments of recognition push the city from the background to the foreground of our viewing experiences. By drawing attention to the continuing significance of the depiction of place in cinema, both in terms of documentation and in terms of fascination, Gorfinkel and Rhodes craft a response to what they view as the largely premature declaration of the death of place, resulting from the homogenizing tendencies of globalization. Here, they draw from the work of cultural geographer Doreen Massey, among others, who have long claimed that a desire for the specificity of place is never quite obliterated in the age of globalization, even in the face of the overwhelming spread of generic architecture in spatial construction across cities the world over. So, the central question that I want to explore in my talk today is whether or not thinking about location shooting through the lens of the archive and the ability of place to exceed the bonds of narrative are in fact the only ways to think about the role of location in any given film. More specifically, can location shot imagery function as the depiction of place that moves beyond document or testimony towards representations that signify with respect to the aspirations, desires, and anxieties regarding the future of cities? If we have a strong tendency to consider location shooting in relationship to the temporal register of the past, what might it mean to consider location shooting with respect to the temporality of the future? And under these circumstances, what might happen to an audience's experience of these places on film? So these particular questions arose from my viewing of a series of contemporary Bengali films set in the city of Kolkata that both engage directly as well as indirectly with debates that have emerged in recent years about the future of the city. So in the second phase of this talk, I will begin by talking to you a little bit about some of these debates about Kolkata's future that have been playing out across both popular and academic channels, and then I'll talk about how a series of Bengali films end up participating in these debates. So, a strand of journalistic discourse has proclaimed that Kolkata has entered into a period of revival and renewal, a narrative that tells the story of the city as having divested itself of its imperial and communist past, the latter heralded by the election of Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee in 2011, spelling the end of 34 years of communist governance. So that is an image of Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee standing in front of the Hooghly River in Kolkata in 2011. So in this discourse of revival in reinvention, Kolkata aspires to the visual appearance of the City of London, in accordance with Banerjee's desire to transform the city into the spitting image of the formal imperial capital of the British Empire, with no irony involved. So, plans that are still in the developmental stages include revamping the city's waterfront, where Banerjee has cited London's South Bank as a potential model. There's also the matter of the building of the Kolkata Eye, often discussed as Banerjee's dream project, which stalled for a period of time, but apparently is slated to open in 2020. And yes, a private firm from London is heavily involved in the building of the Kolkata Eye, apparently. So those are the plans that are under in the developmental stages. In terms of plans to this effect that have already been implemented, there's the installation of Victorian-style trident lamps across the city. Apparently, this was done in such a haphazard fashion that some of them had to be taken down because they were blinding drivers. So, the evocation of London in this discourse is clearly not consistent in a historical sense. The Kolkata Eye brings an image of global London to mind, with its high-rise structures, etc., while the installation of the lamps brings us back to the Victorian era. What London does seem to represent is an aspiration that involves transforming Kolkata from city of decline into a modern city, replete with the kinds of architectural features generally found in such cities, albeit from different historical periods. If we turn our attention now to thinking about the outskirts of the city, there is a rise in satellite townships, a phenomenon that is in evidence across the Indian subcontinent. As Bishnupriya Ghosh has observed, these townships in an Indian context are mostly vertical in their orientation, as they are comprised of high-rise residential towers and other buildings, often corporate in nature. So the model here is Singapore, for a lot of these satellite townships, being seen as the kind of model Asian city in this regard, but in Kolkata it's also London that serves as an example. So this is an image from Newtown, which is a now kind of iconic satellite township located near the Kolkata airport, that is comprised of high-rise residential buildings and IT offices cut across by a spacious highway called the Eastern Metropolitan Bypass. Another example is Urbana, whose claim to fame will eventually rest upon having the highest residential towers in the city, though this site is still under development. So as Bishnupriya Ghosh has argued in her recent work on high-rise horror in Mumbai cinema, the proliferation of luxury flats in cities such as Mumbai and Kolkata assumes the patina of the aspirational, as a marker of global cities that are yet to come in all of their fullness. As Ghosh writes, the promise of these developments is essentially twofold. They enable the middle classes, in this case of Bengal, Kolkata, to escape the horizontal plane of urban existence characterized by crowds, decaying infrastructure, and the general hassles of everyday city life into the vertical plane characterized by spaciousness, emptiness, where one looks down below onto a luscious natural environment. At the same time, there's also the assurance of wired or virtual connectivity that helps mitigate living in such self-contained remote surroundings. In a Kolkata context, sometimes the promise of connectivity is very material, where luxury flats such as Urbana advertise their proximity to Kolkata proper as part of their appeal. These new urban developments are not just targeted towards what Pablo S. Bush terms as an emerging global middle class, but also one that is inclusive of the Bengali diaspora. Bush provocatively claims that it does not matter whether diasporic populations actually live in these flats. It's the idea of them that counts, one that signifies middle-class ambitions for a cosmopolitan, global Kolkata. The rapid transformation of the city over the last several years signifies as the belated apex of an economic shift that began in 1991, when India first opened its doors to neoliberal economic reform. The forms of gentrification that have occurred prior to these developments in Kolkata, which include the forced removal of pavement dwellers and hawkers in 1996 to the outskirts of the city, are all gestures towards an urban facelift that are occurring in full force over the last several years. So this is a discourse of Kolkata Rising, both in terms of a vertical aesthetic that is taking hold of the city's topography, but also in terms of the city's status as one that is rising, or rather catching up, to the ranks of other global cities around the world and with India itself. As Annapurna Shah notes, West Bengal began building high-tech sectors or science parks much later than other comparable Indian cities. Kolkata's post-colonial past does bear partial responsibility for its slow entry into the current global city race. This was a city that was largely lagging behind the agenda of development and economic progress set by Nehru's post-colonial government for the purposes of nation building, for reasons pertaining to the waves of migration stemming from the partition of Bengal in 1947, and before that, the famine of 1943, which caused severe economic strain on the city. Following on from this, the 60s and 70s are often characterized as a period of decline and economic crisis, stemming from a multiplicity of compounding factors, including a deep recession, soaring rates of unemployment, and the arrival of the Naxalite movement to the city, which were a series of armed struggle against class exploitation and discrimination that took root in the Naxalbari region in 1967. In the 1980s, urbanization in Bengal transpired at a slow rate, in keeping with a greater emphasis on improving rural conditions pursued by the leftist coalition government, formed by the Communist Party of India, it's a bad mistake, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, in 1977. A decline in the manufacturing sector, urban infrastructure, and job loss led to the Indian central government in the 1990s to turn its attention to Kolkata once more as a city in need of revival. So this history, which I cannot do justice to in this talk, nevertheless must be raised even in its truncated form, because it is the source of a popular and disparaging view of Kolkata that is circulated broadly, encapsulated in phrases famously used to describe the city, such as urban failure, black hole, or city of dreadful night. This view of the city has worked to obscure some of Kolkata's more positive identities, including that of model colonial city. So it is against this backdrop that the discourse of Kolkata Rising acquires specificity, as a city intent on banishing its disreputable past. A second discourse, though, reveals some of the anxieties that underscore the discourse of Kolkata Rising. I'd like to show you the opening credit sequence, from a film that engages directly with these particular anxieties. So the clip that I'm about to show you is from a film called The Future of the Past, or Bhuter Bhovishat in Bengali, made by Anik Datta in 2012. So the film is a ghost story in the vein of comedy rather than horror. But as you will see, even as early as this credit sequence, the voices and eyes of ghosts are used to tell us a particular story about the city itself.
পূর্ণ অপরিচিত মহিলার রিফ্লেকশন দেখতে পান। কে এই রহস্যময় নারী মূর্তি? মধুমিতা কি ভূত দেখেছিলেন? শহরের বুক থেকে একে একে হচ্ছে হাওয়া পুরো বাড়ি নীলমুটি উড়েছে খুব ঝামেলায় ভূতেদের
সাথে কেউ লড়ছে না প্রশাসন নিরুত্তাপ গোলাগুলি চলছে না নিউজ চ্যানেল অপোজিশন কিছুই তারা করছে বোঝা বিনা বা পুনর্বাসন অনশন বা আন্দোলন হচ্ছে না চাই কিছুই কারণ ভূতেরা কেউ ওটা নন ভূতেরা সব যাবে কোথা হচ্ছে বাতিল করছে বাদ তৈরি হলো এই ছবি তাই করতে তারই প্রতিবাদ
So, as you can see, the future of the past engages very directly with the notion of Kolkata as a city that is vanishing at a rapid pace as a result of the kinds of topographical shifts that the ghosts address in the clip that I just showed you, an anxiety that has been echoed by other authors and scholars. So, for example, author Amit Chaudhary mourns the destruction of colonial homes, many of which have been razed to build condos, shopping malls, etc. And that's the type of home that is featured in the film, The Future of the Past. So Chaudhary argues that Kolkata should take steps to ensure that such areas of the city are declared as heritage sites. So to this effect, he has started something of a campaign on social media, creating an Instagram account featuring these heritage homes, and he created a website called Kolkata Architectural Legacies to draw public attention to the need to preserve the city's architectural legacy. So Chaudhary essentially speaks to a larger anxiety regarding the gradual transformation of Kolkata into a global city, typical of the state of global cities worldwide that are overrun with nondescript or generic forms of architecture. The use of ghosts in The Future of the Past, from the clip I just showed you, is an ideal way of performing a larger critique of how the destruction of older areas of the city entail a disappearance of material traces of the historical past. For Chaudhary, the inability of the city to engage with its existing cityscape, its buildings, its history, its spaces, actually signifies the failure of Kolkata's recent moves toward revival and reinvention. There is then the further question of the exact cost of these development practices and who exactly is being displaced to make way for global Kolkata. To take one example, there has been a lot of controversy regarding the dislocation of farmers and the forced acquisition of land required for the development of Newtown, laying bare the gentrifying aims that underscore Kolkata's development plans, ones that have long rested upon usurping rural land through distressed sales and by declaring them as special economic zones. There are also concerns of an environmental nature, as the condo developments in the eastern edges of the city threaten the fragile ecosystem of the East Kolkata wetlands, made up of fisheries and farms. So both the discourse of revival and that of disappearance that I've been sketching in this talk can be mapped onto larger debates upon globalization more broadly, as a phenomenon characterized by some as fostering a new cosmopolitanism, and by others as that which flattens difference in favor of a homogenized world made to the measure of neoliberal capitalism. What is clear is that Kolkata is a city in a transitional period, with perhaps an end goal of transformation into a global city. And this period of transition has amplified tensions between old and new. So, what do these discourses and debates about the present and future of the city have to do with contemporary Bengali cinema and the politics of place? So the credit sequence that I just showed you from The Future of the Past suggests a heightened relationship between the city and certain trajectories of filmmaking over the last decade. Since 2009, so just before Mamata Banerjee's election as chief minister, a series of commercial Bengali films, later dubbed middle-of-the-road cinema, embraced the city as their primary shooting location. Bengali actor Rahul Bosch is lauded in the popular press with having coined this term middle of the road in 2012, where he claims that middle-of-the-road cinema has led to a rebirth of the Bengali film industry. The late Rituparna Ghosh, a well-known Bengali filmmaker, said in 2011 that he didn't want to discuss Bengali films specifically, but films made in Kolkata as marking new ground, both aesthetically and thematically. This comment alludes to the ascendance of the category of Kolkata-based cinema, which coincides with the narrative arc of Kolkata Rising that I described earlier. Titles of these films include, but are not limited to, Antohin, made in 2009 by Aniruddha Roy Choudhury, and I'll talk about that particular film in more detail as we keep going. Iti Mrinalini by Aparna Sen in 2010. Autograph by Srijit Mukherjee in 2010. Iche by Shibu Prasad Mukherjee and Nandita Roy in 2011. The Future of the Past, of course, by Anik Datta in 2012. And Mach Mishti and More by Moinak Pomik in 2013. And of course there are more, but that's just a little bit of a list for you. Mamita Banerjee tried to capitalize on this sudden surge of interest in Kolkata as shooting location in Bengal when she sent actor Arindam Sil as part of the government's official delegation to the Cannes Film Festival in 2015 to persuade international production houses to shoot their films in Kolkata by offering them incentives, including cost-free shooting locations and nominal fees for security. We can argue that Banerjee's promotion of Kolkata as shooting location on an international scale is part of her broader attempts to transform Kolkata from a city of decline to a city on the rise. So these films have been proclaimed as middle of the road because they walk the line between commercial cinema and art cinema. While middle of the road films avoid the kind of spectacle one typically associates with popular Hindi films, they are certainly not examples of rigorous art cinema. Some of these films are genre films, more specifically thrillers, comedies, melodramas. Some of these films are also about filmmaking. This is true of a film called Autograph, and this is also true of a film of The Future of the Past, from which I showed you the credit sequence. So these two particular films are demonstrative of a kind of cinephilia that runs through this body of work, where explicit reference or homage is made to the films of Satyajit Ray, Mrinal Sen, and Ritwik Ghatak, three figures associated with an earlier wave of filmmaking in the art cinema tradition that exemplified a direct preoccupation with the circumstances of Kolkata in the post-colonial period. The Future of the Past, for example, in the credit sequence that I showed you, that is a clear homage to a film made by Satyajit Ray in 1969, his famous ghost film, Gopika in Bagabain, even using the famous music from that film as a ringtone for one of the characters, and using a version of that music in the opening credit sequence. Recurring characters can also be traced across middle-of-the-road cinema, including the contemporary musician, actor, film director, the modern woman, defined as such through a defiance of tradition. You can find these figures throughout these films. While initially many middle-of-the-road films were independently funded, larger corporate entities such as Reliance Entertainment and Mukta Arts, among others, have been involved in the funding of these films because they're commercially viable. So multiplex cinema is another term that's been thrown at these films. The commercial viability of these films mean that television broadcasters often purchase the satellite rights to the films, which adds to the revenue of production houses and hence another factor in the production of more of these films. So a number of these films push the city of Kolkata from background to foreground even more explicitly by narrativizing aspects of the city's past and its present. But even when not specifically about the city, directors and other personnel involved in the making of these films situate them distinctly as an urban form of cinema, designed to draw urban middle-class audiences back to the theaters to watch Bengali films, away from their television sets or computers, and away from their desires to solely watch popular Hindi cinema. So I'd like to begin starting to wrap up this talk by discussing a specific example of one such film in some detail with respect to its use of location shooting. So I'll be talking a little bit more about Antohin, made by Aniruddha Roy Choudhury in 2009, sorry. So Antohin, in narrative terms, provides a variation on the classic intersecting narrative. So basically, the film brings together a police detective, an investigative journalist, a marketing executive, and an urban developer, among other characters. This is a story of urban alienation as signified through moments of misconnection between characters and through characters that essentially remain estranged from one another. So Anthuhin's evocation of Kolkata as identifiable location is echoed across later examples of what I call the Kolkata-centric versions of middle-of-the-road cinema. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what Kolkata looks like in many of these films. Basically, Kolkata signifies in a double register. On the one hand, you have images that evoke a kind of iconic version of the city, that is primarily used for romanticized, idealized, and nostalgic effect. So a kind of evocation of older images of the city that are coupled with images that signify the new Kolkata. So I'll give you some images to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So these films often include tram rides across the city, car rides down the famous Red Road, and boat rides that take place across a kind of largely emptied out Hooghly River. So while boat rides and tram rides are not a feature of Anthuhin, the drive down Red Road is. Numerous monsoon in the city sequences also proliferate these films, where characters revel in torrential downpours. So there is an extended musical sequence in Anthuhin that features a central character enjoying herself during such a rainstorm. This is a narrative event that does nothing to forward the plot, but it evokes a kind of key association with the city. And yeah, this kind of narrative event is kind of found across many of these films. So that's the old Kolkata. In terms of the new Kolkata, this is often conjured through images of high-rise clusters, as you see here and here. This is set in Newtown. Sleek interiors often proliferate these films. Views of the city from above rather than from below, as well as boat rides and shots that showcase the new Hooghly Bridge in all of its modernist glory. And you can see that in the background of that particular shot. So before returning to Anthuhin and talking a bit more specifically about that film, I'd like to show you a credit sequence from a different film called Mach, Mishti and More, as a film that narrates this distinction that I've been talking about between old and new Kolkata across these films. Basically, I'm showing you this clip as a way of situating Anthuhin within a kind of larger body of filmic work that plays with these distinctions, essentially.
এই যে আর কত ঘুমোবে, এবার উঠে পড়ো আমার রিপ ভ্যান উইঙ্কল, দেখো নয়ন মেলে আমাদের শহরের বাহার। এই 30 বছরে যদি ঘুম ভেঙে উঠতে দেখতে পেতে তোমার এই কলকাতা, চোখে পড়তো কিনা যথেষ্ট সন্দেহ আছে। সেই রাস্তা নেই গো, যে রাস্তায় আমরা কত হেঁটে ঘুরে বেড়িয়েছি। থিয়েটার রোড এখন শেক্সপিয়ার সরণি, পার্ক স্ট্রিট নাকি মাদার টেরেসার। যেখান সেখান থেকে লম্বা লম্বা ব্রিজ কেমন উড়ে এসে জুড়ে বসেছে, নাম দিয়েছে ফ্লাইওভার। একদিক দিয়ে ভালোই করেছো না দেখে, চারপাশে সবই বদলাচ্ছে। এখনকার মেয়েরা প্যান্ট শার্ট পরে ঘুরে বেড়াচ্ছে, তার সঙ্গে ছেলেদের মতো চুল কাটছে, বলে বয় কাট। আমার অবশ্য ভালোই লাগে। তুমি ভাবছো তো যে বুড়ো বয়সে বিমূর্তি হয়েছে আমার? কি জানি, হয়তো তাই। যাকে আজ এলাম, পরে কথা হবে।
আর একদিন তোমার সাথে দেখা হবে, দেখা হবে। বহুদিন পরে শহরে দেখা হবে, দেখা হবে আবার সাথে তোমার, দেখা হবে আবার শহর আমার, দেখা হবে। কফি কাপে চেনা ক্যাপুচিনো তারি ফাঁকে কোনোদিনও যে দেখা হবে দেখা হবে ধোঁয়া ওঠা কাপে মন খারাপে দেখা হবে দেখা হবে
So you can see from both of the credit sequence that I've showed you actually that these films really do explicitly situate themselves within the city and address the city, actually often through the credit sequence and then narratively as the films go on. In any case, you can see how in this credit sequence, the film is narrating the distinction between old and new Kolkata through the lens of nostalgia primarily, echoed through the use of hand-drawn images and through the actor who is featured here, who is Soumitra Chatterjee, who is affiliated most strongly with the cinema of Satyajit Ray. There's also the suggestion in this credit sequence that a diasporic subject is being addressed, in keeping with the tendency to market Kolkata for the Bengali diaspora. So in this credit sequence, you are getting a sense of nostalgia, but also the main characters' acceptance of these particular changes, which points towards what happens much later in the film, where this kind of new version of Kolkata serves to override the old. So Antahin, the film I'm going to talk about now in a bit more detail, offers a similar kind of variation upon this distinction between the old and new, as it is the new Kolkata that serves to mostly override the old city in exterior shots. So Antahin is marked by a series of contrasting images of the city, operating across both a horizontal and a vertical axis. So you have two types of recurring shots of Kolkata in the film. So one is an image like this, images of the streets, images that are curiously empty, given that Kolkata is a city of the crowd, a megacity if you like, and beyond this, the images that I've just shown you, as stated by a central character in the film, are apparently taken at the height of rush hour. A second set of images revolves around the Kolkata skyline. So this is one example here. And this is another example, skyline imagery at night. And this is a manufactured skyline as opposed to the other one, which is clearly shot on location. And in this image here, you can see the expanse of greenery that surrounds the condo, coinciding with a similar promise made off screen by residential tower complexes in the city, such as Urbana, right? The whole point is if you live in these satellite townships, you can escape from the kind of bustle of the city into this eco-friendly paradise. So that's how those flats are advertised, and you see something similar happening in these films. As one character remarks in this film, it is only from above that the beauty of the city becomes visible. So these two methods of rendering the city in this film, both on a horizontal and on a vertical axis, produce idealized and transcendental views of the city, some of which are literally manufactured, which rescue the city from its crowds, its grit, and its grime. Omission is the key tactic that is employed in this film, which involves editing out a surrounding context, which might reveal another story of the city, as well as emptying out images of the city that are generally populated by the famous Kolkata crowds. There's a third type of horizontal space that is evoked verbally in the film, but only visualized obliquely. So V.K. Mehra, who you see here, is an urban developer in this film, who apparently builds multi-story buildings and condos by displacing the urban poor from their homes, a project aptly titled El Dorado. This aspect of the film engages quite directly with the actual controversies that have arisen over the building of Newtown and other such satellite townships. So both the allegations against Mehra regarding his potentially corrupt development practices, in addition to the opening sequence of the film, which I haven't showed you, but the opening sequence of the film begins with an arms smuggling ring that is caught next to this development project. This particular narrative event and the opening sequence, they function as counterpoints to the use of idealized urban imagery in the film that I've just been showing you. However, the film works to basically temper its indictment of the dangerous practices of urban development by making this figure, Mehra, into someone who is rather ambiguous. So Brinda Bose is a journalist in the film who launches a public investigation into the development practices of Mehra and his team. And Mehra, she basically interviews him, and Mehra basically says that he rehouses the people he has relocated to make these building projects. They've all relocated willingly, apparently, and he even built schools for them. So he says this to Brinda, and then the film essentially never confirms or denies whether or not anything that he has said is in fact true. So Brinda is eventually killed in a car crash, and earlier narrative events allow us to infer that she may have been murdered on behalf of Mehra, who characterizes her investigation of his practices as essentially a thorn in his side. However, this reading of events remains ambiguous. Mehra, upon meeting Brinda for the first time, tells her that he wished his dead stepdaughter would have grown up to be like her. When accused by his wife near the end of the film of murdering Brinda so that he could continue with his corrupt development practices, he claims he wouldn't have done so, given he saw Brinda as a model for his dead stepdaughter. Again, we have no idea if that is true or if it isn't. The film basically doesn't confirm or deny his version of events. Andahin is an example of one type of city film that is part of this recent wave of Bengali cinema, where I argue that middle-of-the-road cinema seems to foster middle-of-the-road politics, as the film takes an ambiguous stand regarding development practices. While there is some attempt clearly in this film to engage with the darker discourse of urban envelopment involving forced displacement, land acquisition, and corruption in visual terms, the film ultimately privileges streamlined and transcendental urban imagery as depicted from above and on the ground. In its engagement with the debates transpiring about this transformative period in Kolkata's history, Andahin participates in the discourse of revival and renewal, where elements of the old city are made subordinate to all that is new. Location shot imagery is carefully selected and transformed to suit the film's narrative trajectory rather than exceeding it. In this time of speculation and uncertainty regarding the city's future, images shot on location in this film, tinged with the patina of material certainty, provide a convincing set of images of the new Kolkata as though this city were already here. While middle-of-the-road films use a variety of narrative and visual strategies, the argument that I've been trying to make is that I believe these films demand a different model for the assessment of the effects and significance of the use of location shooting, one that moves us from outside of the past and into the future. Films like Andahin participate in these wider debates about the future of the city, so that the use of location shooting isn't really in service to documentation or the archive, but rather in service to specifically middle-class aspirations, as well as anxieties about Kolkata in a transitional phase. Andahin in particular extends the aspiration of a modern, empty, cosmopolitan city, past its logical home within an enclosed satellite township, to the entirety of the city. As such, the gap between Kolkata of the future and the current material reality of the city are collapsed within this film through spatial as well as narrative means. So this is just one example, of course. Other examples of films of this type offer frictionless visions of the city, where old and new are melded together seamlessly. In these films, including some of the ones I had mentioned earlier, Kolkata is presented in a state of global becoming, which acquires an unmistakable middle-class sheen that sidesteps tension or conflict related to caste, religion, gender, or ethnicity. For filmmaker Patrick Keeler, filmmaking on location offers up the possibility of the transformation of that location through a variety of methods, including a fictional politics or fictional solidarity. In the case of the films that I've been discussing, location shot imagery doesn't exceed narrative demands, but in fact is made to their measure, producing a cinematic city of the future, and in the case of Andahin, as though his future has already arrived. However, the future of the past, the clip that I showed earlier in this talk, demonstrates the potential of this form of popular cinema to engage with the tensions between a Kolkata that is rapidly vanishing and one that is steadily on the rise. I think I will end it here. Thank you. Let's stay here.
have time for questions. KK has a microphone. And so do I see my role very much as simply corralling questions, and I think I'll open the floor there. I have a couple in mind, but I will happily see them to you. So please, if you have any comments or questions.
I don't know whether the figure appears in this genre of filmmaking, and perhaps it's to sort of a previous generation, but I'm thinking of the figure of the peasant or the farmer arrived from the countryside into the city, who discovers the city there, and the narrative is about his discovery or his recognition of how he or she or his family could live in the city in this new world. It's more a personal anecdote. I remember when I first went to New York, I heard a sound on Fifth Avenue, which I'd never heard before, I thought. It was a car hitting the bumps in the asphalt. And I realized that this sound I'd heard all my life in American movies, in cops stories on TV and so forth. Now, I don't think it's likely, given the popularity of popular cinema in India, that a peasant arriving from the countryside would arrive in the city without a previous sense of what the city was. And I wonder how that problem is featured in the films that you're discussing.
This is a very good question, and it's not actually featured in the films that I've been discussing. In fact, what you get instead is sometimes you have a different form, you have a form of return, where you have people who have been living abroad returning to Kolkata in order to try to make a life or a living there. So Mach Mishti and More, the film that I showed, the second clip that I showed, you have that kind of figure in that film. But you don't have the kind of figure that you're describing, at least not in the ones that I have seen.
And not this prehistory of the visual in other films that they've seen in the past in the countryside. When they arrive, it's like whatever I've seen in the film. There's none of that. Does it happen in Bollywood? I don't know. Is it eviscerated?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in Bollywood cinema, but yeah, but there are, from my viewing of that kind of narrative event, it does occur in other kinds of films, but not in this body of work that I've been discussing. No, but there is a different form of return actually that is quite interesting, and it is often people living abroad.
Thank you, Malini. That's a great topic that you have raised and sort of studied on. Just wondering that you have used some of the movies from the Bengali, genre. What about the movies like where Hugh Grant went to the city and sort of filmed as an actor at that time when he was very young, The Bengali Night, or the new film that has quickly given the global audience a chance to see what is this city all about, because Calcutta has definitely been a city for a very long time, not just for the Bengalis, but for Portuguese, for English, for the Dutch, and at the same time it also gave us sustainable resources to the nearby states, which is the northeastern state, Bihar, Orissa, because it used to be the second largest city in the British Empire, and it is definitely one of the cities that was first had its phone line connected from Calcutta to London. My question is, I saw this new movie called The Jungle Cry, which is about young underprivileged kids playing rugby in the city, and that's all happening at the Maidan, which is the central park of Calcutta. Now, my narrative to that is that how is the city reflecting on these people? Not everybody is born rich or middle class. There is people who are coming through the city, like Lakshmi Mittal, he's one of the famous, now the billionaire, steel magnate across the globe. He played in the streets of Calcutta, he grew up there. Now, is it his responsibility to look at the city? Yes, it is. He doesn't. That's a different story. But how are the films reflecting on that? I want to know whether you have done any research on that.
Do you mean these films that I've been talking about?
No, these films and others I'm talking about. But you have just predominantly worked on one genre,
Yes, I have.
the Bengali ones. But there's other films that we made in that city from different countries.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a huge question. If I focus it a little bit on the contemporary moment, there are, of course, other films that are reflecting on this period of transition that I've been talking about in very different ways. So I have been concentrating in this talk on films that do seem to feature simply a middle-class version of these changes, but there are other films that are very interesting. There's one called Spring in a Colony. I don't know if you've seen. Yeah, so that film is a really good example that's also reflecting on these changes, but not in this way. That film is highlighting more of the frictions between the old city and the new. And there's this really interesting journey that takes place on this film where you begin in South Kolkata and you begin with the history of refugees there, partition refugees. And then you move to Central Kolkata, which for many years was known as White Town, and then you move to New Town as this kind of strange, surreal future. So you're able to see a kind of transition when you're moving in these spaces. It's like you have the city's past and the city's future all projected in one film. So there are different kinds of films that deal with these kinds of questions. Your question is very broad because there's the question of the outsider film and the insider film, right? So the outsider film, films made by people who maybe don't live in the city, who've just arrived to make a particular film in this city. There are many different examples, but I can't give you an assessment of all of what they're doing, but there is obviously a difference, right, moving from the outside in. Yeah.
Do we need a mic? Yeah, no, thank you for the talk. It's really interesting and I've learned a lot. I have two questions. The first question is about Calcutta's film, the tradition of Calcutta's film industry, or the art film. It seems that Calcutta was more famous for its art cinema versus Bombay is more famous for its commercial Bollywood, and so I think you put it very nicely about cinema, those competition of being global city. There's also a competition of film industries, and it seems that Calcutta is kind of moving to the middle ground, almost moving to the Bollywood, but not quite. So I wanted to know just the dialectic of these two cities in urbanization and in film history, and in this moment. So that's the first question, because I feel like Calcutta for me is always this kind of intellectual, the Bengali intellectual, the art cinema. Yeah. So it's very interesting to see that it's like different from what my impression was. Another question is about location shooting and animation, because the clips you've shown, they were animation, right? And or not animation. I mean, one is animation, and the other was kind of illustrated stills that had an aesthetic of kind of architectural drafts almost. And then you've also shown images of empty streets, and these were shot on location. So I think it's really interesting because this is basically, when people say location shooting, it's like you go out in the studio into the location. But here it's turning the city into a film studio. And there's a lot of control, so I can imagine there's policing of these locations in order for the location not to be a location, but a studio space. So I thought, that must involve a lot of government intervention, right? Just in order for this to actually happen. And also, I'm also interested in different technologies to make it happen, like the drones, for example, that would go from top, so that you don't see the people. So I think it really is interesting that you turn a real city into a virtual city, and then, the manufactured skyline is always also really interesting. It's kind of animation-like, right? It's like this moon. Yeah, so I'm very interested in that crossing.
Thank you very much for those questions. So I'll begin with the first one. What's really interesting is pre-partition, so pre-1947, there was a competition between what was then known as the Bombay film industry and the Kolkata film industry as being the two sort of largest film industries in India. And the competition was about, popular cinema versus prestige cinema. And so that's how Kolkata films often marketed themselves in that time period, as offering a kind of prestige alternative to popular film. So that's very interesting. And of course, after partition, that was no longer sustainable for many reasons. But now it's very interesting. A lot of the practitioners who have been involved with middle-of-the-road cinema do say things like, we are now on par with Bollywood. So I think, yes, I think that competition is part of what's happening now. But again, I don't know that these films are exactly offering prestige. They are popular, and they're commercially viable, but they do certain things. Like, for example, if popular Hindi cinema is most known for its dance sequences, etc., you'll find moments like that in these films, but there's no dancing most of the time. It's just musical interludes. So the sequences that you would be familiar with in very, very popular mainstream Hindi cinema, you will find variations of that in these kinds of films, but they're a little bit subdued, basically. So I think something of that tradition of prestige is still there. It's also there in the way that a lot of these films are referencing the period of art cinema. It's really interesting. There's a film called Autograph, for example, and it's about a director who is remaking a film by Satyajit Ray called Nayak, and that's what the film is about. So it's very interesting because in certain respects, some of these films are situating themselves within this kind of broader lineage of art cinema filmmaking, while also being very clear about the fact that these are not, it's not that cinema. This is a cinema that is being tailored for this particular period in Kolkata's history. So it's complex. The dynamics are complex, but your question is really great because that does seem to be what's happening. In terms of your other question, I like the way you put that, right? That the idea that an actual city is being turned into a set is a very interesting way of talking about what I've been talking about. I really like it because what it implies is a measure of control, right? And that's the whole point of location shooting. No, it's supposed to be about contingency and, anything can happen when you shoot on location. The happy accident. It's the happy accident that you're trying to do away with in these kinds of films. And I think it's very important, and it's very interesting in terms of how control is being asserted over cities in general through surveillance and all kinds of other mechanisms. And you can see how that's being, you can see an aesthetic variation of that in these films. And I do think it's very interesting. And I think it's also important because in the book that I was mentioning by Elena Gorfinkel and John David Rhodes, Taking Place, they say in the book that films are either shot in studio or on location. And they use the word either. And that hasn't been true for a very long time, right? It's a combination of these techniques. It's just a question of how the combination is working in these films. And I think in these films, the credit sequence often seem to be sites of animation or where indexicality is kind of muted. This is also true of the film I was talking about, Antahim, where you have these images of the city in that credit sequence, but they've been made over, basically. So you'll have an image of the Hooghly, you'll have an image of a bridge, a famous bridge, and it'll be red in color, right? So the bridge is signifying Kolkata, but the red is actually gesturing towards the narrative events that are about to follow, which are rather unsettling. So I think the credit sequence often ends up being this kind of interesting place as a kind of declaration of the film's interest in the city, and maybe also a place where other modes of representation seem to take over. And then in the case of Antahim, I think what really interested me about that film is the way location shot imagery seems to be used to suggest that the future has arrived. It's already here. And it's not, right? So, yeah, it's not here. And so I think that's a bit jarring. I found it jarring anyway, and maybe, I'm not from Kolkata. Like my parents are from Kolkata. I grew up in Canada, but I've spent time there, and I always find it quite jarring, the difference between watching these movies and being in the city. Anyway, I'm rambling now, but yeah, thanks for those questions. They're really, really interesting.
I'm going to jump in really quickly because the idea of staging the city and becoming, you mentioned diaspora, and I'm wondering whether there's a relationship there in the films that you're looking at, or perhaps others, to diasporic communities, or how much is this also a projection? You mentioned the scenario of people coming back, rediscovering the city. Can you talk a little bit whether that's something that you've also looked at?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I don't think these films are not just marketed towards a diaspora, right? It's more like the diaspora, this is my opinion anyway, it's more like the diaspora is part of this new image of the global city. They're part of it, but it's not simply targeted or tailored towards them. It's also about the middle class inhabitant of the city, kind of wanting to see their city depicted in a way that doesn't reinforce the narrative of, Kolkata is a city in decline, right? Or like the city of joy version of Kolkata, right? Is this site of intense poverty, is a city where the inhabitants need rescuing, right? So this idea of a global city is as much as, it's for the inhabitant of the city as much as it is for a diasporic audience. And certainly, people of the diaspora do watch these films. So that is part of the audience that is watching these films too.
Is that mobility depicted?
Which mobility?
And in the sense of, scenes of, I'm thinking of scenes of airports, people arrive, people leave, the city moves into a global space through these sorts of characters. Is that something that happens in these films as well?
In some of these films, yeah. The ones that do feature diaspora characters, and they don't all feature them, but the ones that do, yeah, there is movement of that type. Or of people deciding to stay, which is interesting. So they're staging returns, right? People from the diaspora who move back to the city and decide to make a living there. Although in Much Mystery and More, they leave, but yeah, that kind of mobility is featured in that way.
Oh, thank you. That was a brilliant talk. I'm not a movie enthusiast. However, I do relate to your talk in terms of the literature. In the Bangla literature that's available, like starting from that back in those days, from Rabindranath Tagore to Satyajit, now coming on to the contemporary writers like Shunil or Shamresh. So you can actually see the changes in their writing style, where the older version of the literature are more concentrated on nature, how greenery is and everything, where on the other hand, the contemporary writers more focus on the roads, the yellow taxis, how the small lanes in Kolkata is. So this is how the literature or the art has changed. However, what I don't understand is why would the politics of Kolkata, or as much as I understand about the politics of whole subcontinent, where they actually go for, because it's democracy, they go for the popular part of it, right? So why would you, or Mamata Banerjee or people like that, care about art films, whereas more commercial viable films are there, which are, seen by more audiences, where these art films are more concentrated on that middle class, right? So why would the investments of these politicians will come into this sort of a film?
So I would consider these films to be popular, right? And so Mamata Banerjee is actually very supportive of these particular films. So they are popular, but they are marketed, they're targeted very specifically, though, towards middle-class audiences. There's a range of popular cinema in Bengal, right? There's not one regional popular cinema. There are many, many different types. And this is just one of these types. So are you asking me why they...
Like, from a political point of view.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, because it focuses on a very specific class, right?
Yeah.
As much as I understand with my little knowledge about the politics of subcontinent, they usually go for the popular part, right? They would invest in projects that will actually influence most of the people, most of their voter base. So it doesn't actually add up when we're talking about, this just a middle class.
So the I don't have an answer to this, but it would be interesting to know who else watches these films and what their thoughts are, right? Yeah, classes outside the middle class. It would be interesting to know what they think, but I don't have an answer to that question, unfortunately.
So, first of all, thank you very much, and I learned a lot about things I don't know much about, but when I was listening, I couldn't help but think of a few other things. One, that what you said about location and film locations as sites of fantasy in some way or another that distract us from the plot. I mean, that is, you could make a big argument for the correlation of real estate development and film over the 20th century in the entire history of film, because we are seduced by location. We want the spaces, and the people who set design and everything, they know that. But what you posed reminded me more of kind of, almost I could hear the rhetoric of, the 19th century Paris, where at the same time there was a celebration of a kind of modernity and a deep nostalgia for Le Vieux Paris, which was being destroyed by this, this new kind of modern thing, which was housemanization, a version of which it's hard not to see in some of these planned developments. And in other words, what's the relation of this kind of post-colonial sort of, if you like, modernization project, this very globalizing post-colonial, and sort of the older histories of modernity and its inevitable struggles, political and cultural struggles, that sort of cinema has displayed for a long time. I just wondered how you would connect your project with other wider projects on location in cinema and modernity.
I think it's less discussed, actually, when we're talking about this body of work. And that's what interests me about it, thinking about modernity and location not in the West, right? And thinking about what it looks like in other spaces, and thinking about what it looks like in a city like Kolkata versus a city like Mumbai versus other kinds of cities that seem to have gotten a lot more press about how these things actually play out. That's what I find interesting about looking at Kolkata in particular, and thinking about how the history of modernization has worked in this city and how it's been very different, in fact, from Mumbai and other cities.
And you mentioned Singapore as the kind of, I'm afraid I could not resist thinking about Crazy Rich Asians, a ghastly film, but in which location is used really interesting, so that there's a sort of deep nostalgia for, street food, and then there are these giant over wealthy houses and these beautiful flats that are all, perfectly adorned with, and some of the things you said struck home, that Singapore is a kind of fantasy model for a kind of authoritarian globalism that these things represent. And I just wondered is that something we can map across a number of films and a number of cultures, or is it specific to Kolkata?
No, we can definitely map it. I mean, I think what's interesting is, so I mentioned someone named Bishnupriya Ghosh has been doing work in this area, and so the films that she talks about are what she calls Mumbai high-rise horror films, which are a series of horror films that are set in these high-rises, right? So that's a completely different kind of film than these films. Which are not just horror films, there are all kinds of films that seem to be dealing with the question of the city. So I think we can map it, but at the same time, there is a specificity depending on where we go. And when she's talking about Mumbai high-rise horror films, she's raising Singapore in particular as a kind of model for these high-rises in the actual city of Mumbai. But again, in the Kolkata context, it's Singapore, but it's also London. And I think that's really interesting. And it's really interesting the way the colonial history of the city is being evoked and not evoked at all at the exact same moment. But yeah, definitely these things can be traced across the range of cinema. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the insightful talk. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, Kolkata has been known, historically that region has been, sort of epicenter of a certain kind of politics, which you alluded to as well in the 60s and 70s. Now, given current circumstances, and the support and endorsement from the chief minister or the government. To what extent can the contemporary films explore the contemporary politics, and to what extent is there a certain level of censorship, or at least if not explicit, but at least implicit, because you have a certain endorsement from. So can you question that government, or criticize or critique that government?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are films that are critical of these developments, and they are these popular films. So The Future of the Past is a good example. And he made a follow-up film to that called, what's it called again? Ashturya Pradip, or The Astonishing Lamp, which is a kind of Aladdin story that is also about similar issues of this kind of discord between old Kolkata and new town. So I think a lot of these, there are films that do explore these politics and can explore these politics, but my sense is, from reading interviews with some of these filmmakers, they're really on board with this kind of discourse of revival and reinvention. They want to participate in it. So it feels to me like there is a bit of a correlation between these filmmakers and their politics, and the politics of Mamata Banerjee. I can't speak for everyone, of course, but for some of these filmmakers, it seems like this is the story they want to tell, actually. And there are others who also use this kind of popular model to tell other stories. So you have a variety of different kinds of work.
Because John was asking about the figure of the rural, the rural figure coming into the city, and I thought, the rural is really the flip side of the coin of the city. So if we talk about city, we have to talk about what's non-city, right? Yes. And also you're talking about these satellite places, and also just from some of the clips you've shown. I thought that's very interesting how the greeneries were, because like in one of the scenes there's like a living room, and then there are cactus, right, growing on the back, So there is this kind of, sort of the greeneries or the rural kind of going into the city, but in a very sort of controlled fashion. And you also mentioned the ecology, and when we think about ecology, we think about the city in relation to other places, and so I wanted to just to hear a bit more about that, whether it's the city's relation to the rural or the city relation to somewhere else, but just to hear a bit more about that.
Thank you for that question. I think it's interesting that the way you mentioned the cactus, and also the figure of the rural does come into a film like Antaheen. It does, except that they have no existence apart from the middle class characters of the film. So what happens is you see them, the investigative journalist Brinda at one point interviews some of these rural people, these farmers. And she asked them, do you want to leave here? Are you being forced to relocate? Are you happy to relocate? But we only see them through a computer screen watched by another character. We actually never see those characters in their own space, apart from some kind of narration or mediation through middle class characters. So the rural does figure in some of these films in a controlled fashion, but sometimes not at all. I think Antaheen's a really interesting example of a film that tries to engage with these questions directly and then sidesteps them. But a number of these films don't go there as such. So it functions as a kind of, the rural functions as a kind of absence presence. You can't talk about the city without what's happening in the city right now without talking about those places, but they don't always figure in the films.
Sorry, the other question is, I was very surprised when I heard you talk about the communist period, where it was dark, and you said it was dark. Yes, and so I'm very interested in what kind of images this period had yielded in terms of the city. Because when I think about China, that's where I work on, the communist period was taking so much pride in electrification, and it was all, so I'm very glad that in Bengal, the communists didn't do that. Instead, they actually, tailored the city's growth to its people. Like, I think that's...
For a while.
I don't know if it happened, but I mean, definitely not in China. In China, we enslaved people to build, whatever infrastructure there was. So I'm very interested in that period and what kind of, because this would be a period when they're looking at other, communist states, right? And their, sort of state capitalist development, not state capital, I mean social, I don't know what to call it, but I'm just wondering how that period figured in. Yeah.
So the story, it starts off well in terms of their interest in rural populations, and then it goes really, really badly, where they start seizing land from rural populations for these developments before Mamata Banerjee is elected. So it goes badly. But during that period, a lot of the films were they were marketed towards rural populations. So that's a lot of what was going on. And then you also had films that were set in the city. And so Buddhadev Dasgupta is a really good example of someone working in the art cinema tradition who was making films in this period. And his Kolkata is a Kolkata of the crowd, basically, where the imagery is not that different from the kinds of images you would find in films made in the art cinema tradition in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But he was an art cinema practitioner. So this wave of popular films is interesting because it's about returning to the city in a way. And I think that might be why so many of these recent films do have these kind of odes to the city, such explicit odes to the city.
We have time for another question.
Thank you for the talk. I'm of Indian background, but not of Kolkata, so I learned stuff from this. So my question is about the feedback that these films have had on the politics or on other films. Like what was the first film? Like it was in 2009.
Yeah.
And then there was a later film in 2014 or whatever. So how have these films have feedbacks between themselves? That's my question.
Say that last part again?
So how have these films had feedback between themselves?
It's really interesting because they're so similar to one another. Similar in terms of plot, similar in terms of imagery, but also in terms of actors and personnel involved in all of these films. So you have some of these, an actor, Parambrata Chaudhary, he was an actor in many of these films, and then he went on to make a film that is basically like one of these films. So there does seem to be a lot of cross-pollination going on, which I think is interesting, because they end up looking like a cohesive body of work. And they're still being made, and there are lots of them being made. So I think if we can say a film like Antohin might have kicked it off, there are many more films since. And it's also interesting because a lot of these filmmakers are first-time filmmakers. And so some of these people have been involved in advertising and other kinds of things, and then they go on to make their first film, and it's this type of film. And what's interesting is, in some of the films themselves, they seem to be stories about directors making middle-of-the-road films. So it is incredibly, incredibly cohesive. And it might have to do with the popularity factor, I would think, right? You keep making the same types of films to keep an audience, basically. Yeah.
I think you also have doctors who are making these films as well. One of them is Chamil Paha, the person, the director is a doctor. He left his medicine degree and became a film director. And but coming to the point that you are raising again and again, these films are actually bringing in dollars to the city, which we saw going down the drain when the communists were there in terms of the closure of the manufacturing, not having enough jobs for the young people. Now at least a person can become a cameraman or something like that, which long term, and short term also it's making the city look a little bit more progressive. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the communist history of Bengal is complex, right?
Yes.
I think it's a complicated history, and I don't think it's just a matter of. I don't. I'm clearly very critical of these films, though I see what you're saying, and I think, in some senses, you're right, and certainly that's how they narrate their own story, right? That now Bengal has a film industry, a thriving film industry, and it's true, right? And in a way, it is a film industry that seems geared towards emerging filmmakers, which is rare in most film industries around the world, right? So there are some interesting ramifications or consequences to this type of filmmaking, but obviously I am concerned about, its projection of the city as being without tension, right? Without conflict. That's troubling. Yeah, I find it troubling.
Just a footnote to a hard question about during the communist regime from 79 to until Moda came. I think there were Mrinal Sen and others. They had produced a number of films, which is not your part of the study, so that's why perhaps you don't have to look. But there had been lots of movies which are very powerful and which had been focused on not only in cities but also in countrysides. Mrinal Sen is basically one of the person who had been very much pioneer in that area. So wonderful, powerful, and very sophisticated, I would say, and that has been also, as you know, acknowledged internationally.
Yeah.
So we had that sort of films. Thank you.
And for those who are interested to see a film by Mrinal Sen tomorrow night, thank you, Dylan. Your commission's coming later. Tomorrow night, Malini will be at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, who partners with us on the series to introduce, in fact, a film by Mrinal Sen, Interview from 1970. So if you're interested to see the cinema that Dilip was so kindly introducing just then, Malini will be there at the gallery tomorrow night to introduce that film in a little bit more context. And with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Malini Guha.